Alrighty, greetings and various assorted salutations. What we're going to be looking at today is our first video. We're going to be going into prehistory and tracking time. Now we're going to mainly focus on tracking time because, well, prehistory is, well, prehistory, and this is a history class. We will talk about prehistory in a little bit, though. But first, let's go into tracking time. First off, we do need to talk about what is prehistory. Prehistory is it's an older term that maybe has fallen a bit out of favor, but the idea behind prehistory is that prehistory is before written records. The idea behind prehistory is the designation was developed when historians looked at things and said, well, what do we call things before written records? Because most of the tools that historians use are, well, prehistory are written records. And so that's what prehistory means. That doesn't mean that everything is written down or that historians only study things that are written down. It just means that our biggest source base, written sources, are not available in the prehistory period. In case you're wondering what that amounts to, prehistory is going to be things like, the dinos, cavemen, Stone Age, things like that, where we just don't have written records. And so that's why we don't spend a whole lot of time on the prehistory stuff, is because we are a history class. We're ancient civilizations, and civilizations, for the most part, are readily apparent when there's written records. But in case you're wondering what that amounts to, what we're looking at for a basic timeline is, let's see here, about 5,300 years ago, first written records. Writing really takes off, though, so what happens is we have some really early written records, and there aren't a lot. Partially because 5,300 years ago is a long time for anything to last. So there aren't a whole lot of records from that time period. But we know that the Bronze Age is when writing really started taking off. So that was about 2,500 BC to 800 BC. Oops. You try getting used to using a pen. We also see more writing, and essentially writing becomes more and more and more and more popular. Widespread literacy, however, is not really a thing until the 20th century, where you actually you can grab almost anyone off the street and say, hey, can you read and write? Most people by the 20th century can say, yes, I can probably do that to varying degrees. So actually, if you look at it, most of human history, most humans could not read or write. The downfall of the human race, the 21st century, is when we get memes. And that joke is way funnier in the in-person lecture. Anyways, so this is so prehistory is anything before 5,300 years ago. But most historians don't really get started until you start talking about different civilizations, like the Romans, the Egyptians. And we'll talk about what a civilization is in this class. But right away, you'll probably notice that I've got something called BC and the 20th century, and we need to learn how to tell time. Because in ancient civilizations, telling time is a bit more complicated. Because we actually use one measurement system, but it's a bit more complicated than what most people are used to. So, with that being said, let's see what our next agenda item is. We've defined prehistory. We'll look at the key terms in a bit. We need to define BCE and BC. Just so you're aware, these are the same. Likewise, AD and CE are the same as well. I'll get to why they're called that in a second. But first we need to know what this is. And we need more space. We'll look at that chart in a second. So, what we have with BC is this is kind of the before Christ is what most people think of it as. We in the Western world and much of the world use the Christian calendar, a modified version of the Christian calendar. And so BC means before Christ, before the birth of Jesus Christ, as a historical event. The other term that is interchangeable and popular with less religious people or people seeking more religious neutrality is something called BCE, which means before Common Era. So these two terms are interchangeable. BCE equals BC. They're equal. But there's other videos that go into the debate over why they're called that. But most of ancient civilizations, we're looking at BC and BCE, before Common Era. How you count in BC, let me pull up my chart. But how you count in BCE or BC is a bit different than what we do nowadays, because we live in a different time period than what we're studying. So for most of BC, most of ancient civilizations, we are counting down to 0. 0 being the birth of Jesus Christ, is what we're counting down to. So in that sense, let's go with 64 BC. The next year that would come, it's New Year's, then it would be 63 BC. So the bigger the number is, the further back it is in ancient civilizations in BC, because we're counting down to 0. But whereas the era we live in, let me change colors here. What we live in is something called CE or AD. These are the two terms. CE means Common Era. So you've got before Common Era, and now you've got Common Era. Apparently there's no plans for an after Common Era. And then AD is Latin for the phrase Anno Domini. I apologize, my Latin is atrocious. I didn't take it for very long and didn't pick much up. Anyways, but what we have is Common Era and AD, Anno Domini. You can just call it AD. And these two terms are interchangeable. And this is the era we live in now. This is the era that World War II happened in. This is the era that the French Revolution, the American Revolution, a lot of the Industrial Revolution, a lot of change and a lot of things that we think of as being more recent happened in the AD-CE era. And the difference with them is AD counts up. So, it's actually January when I'm making this video. So last year was 2019. The next year is 2020. We're counting up. The other way, if you're looking at these two together, because some civilizations and some things we talk about will actually transition from BC to AD. What we'll see happen is the way it works is it works on a timeline. So if you're good at math, you'll probably do better at this than some people. So in the middle, we've got 0 BC. Over here, we'd have 64 BC. Right here, we would have 63 BC. And then over here, we have 2019 AD. We dropped the AD for the most part because we're so far into this century, it's not really an issue most of the time. And right now, we are in the current year of 2020 AD. So, to review that again, you are counting down when you're in BC, and then you are counting up when you're in AD, and it fits on a time on a number line. So if you think of it that way, this is how we're counting. The reason I spend a lot more time on this than say in a U.S. history class is all of United States history takes place in AD, well into AD, almost 2,000 years in. 1700s, but no. So that's kind of the key thing here is we are mostly focusing on the BC, the BCE era. However, some of the ancient civilizations we talk about, like the Mayans, the Aztecs, the Inca, the Byzantines, they're in the AD era. So that's why we take some time to mention that. But let's scroll up and check the list again. So I've gone over BC, I've gone over AD. These are just things you need to be aware of, because once we mention them, it's kind of like reading a clock. People just quit talking about it after you learn how to read it. In fact, I didn't get a refresher on how to read clocks until I took German when it became important again. Then I got a review when I took French. Now I have no clue what time it is. Anyways, let's get to kind of give you an idea of when things are happening. I built a little timeline, and we're going to start with the most recent and then crawl our way back in time. So, actually, since this is last semester's timeline, I need to add something to it. So we've got 2020 AD, and that is the start of the spring semester. And last teaching of ancient civilizations. Unfortunately, due to policy changes, this is the last session of Ancient Civ. But I'm making the video so that, well, the memory lives on. Anyways, and then 2019 is when the fall semester wrote various insults for you in Egyptian hieroglyphics, so you'll get to see that. 1945 is when World War II ended, AD. We've got 1776 AD, when the Declaration of Independence was published. We have 730s AD, and that is when horses that escaped from New Spain or Central America escaped and reached the Great Plains. You might be asking, how do we know this? Well, the Native Americans of the Great Plains, they keep track of time too, in a different way. I'll talk about that in a bit. But that's when they observe, oh, these four-legged creatures came up and we decide to ride horses. In 1492, Christopher Columbus crossed the ocean blue. He was convinced he did. 1428, so now we're getting into ancient civilizations. 1428 AD is the founding of the Aztec Empire. 250 AD is when the classic period of the Mayans was. 1095, which is in AD, is when the First Crusade occurred. 622 AD is the founding of the religion of Islam. 70 AD is the sacking of Jerusalem by the Roman Empire. 64 AD is the Fire of Great Rome, the Great Fire of Rome during the rule of Emperor Nero. And now we're getting into the BC era. It's remarkable. A lot of things have happened since, but we're starting to get into the older parts. So just for a point of reference, if you're one of those people who reads the Bible, if you're wondering when the reign of King Solomon would have been, that would have been 931 BC. And then we go even older. You'll notice the numbers go up, so that means we're going back. In 1213 BC, we have the reign of Ramses II of Egypt, one of the greatest pharaohs. 5400 BC is founding the first city, Eridu. I probably mispronounced it. 10,000 BC is a nice, easy number to remember. That's the last ice age. And then if we go really far back, this is when the dinos existed, or at least the Jurassic period. So, for those of you who are Jurassic Park fans, or set at configuring your time machine, I'd be a bit more accurate, but this is the approximate date you're going to be shooting for. But that's kind of what gets you the idea of what's going on in the world. As we go throughout this class, I don't focus a whole lot on dates, because one of the big challenges that we see is we don't always know the exact date of a lot of historical events. We're not as sure about a lot of things. But to give you an idea, like you'll often see before a date, you'll see a C and then like a number, 20. Let's go with 23 BC. That means circa, which means around. It means we don't have an exact clue when the date is, but circa means we just don't know. No, so that sometimes pops up a bit when we don't know the exact date. Anyways, let's see here. We've looked at the timeline. We looked at the timeline, yep. So let's look at some key terms. Now, I'm going to be honest, we don't spend a lot of time on prehistory because we are an ancient civilizations class. But there are a few big ideas that are developed in prehistory that are very important to understanding, well, the entirety of human civilization. The big thing that we're going to talk about is the agricultural revolution. Essentially, most civilizations depend on farming, period. Most civilizations farm, but humans did not start out farming, and not all humans took to farming. Some humans chose to maintain nomadic lifestyles, like the Mongols, the Lakota, and groups like that. But the agricultural revolution is one of those key terms. We'll talk about nomads later. We have domestication, where basically animals and plants are adapted, or some might argue that humans are adapted to them, and where we basically tame or direct the growth and cultivation of certain plants and animals. We have something called civilization, which here's a definition that you need to be aware of, but I'm going to be honest, there are many definitions for civilization, and that'll be one of the topics that is going on in our class, that is ongoing and developing. We have something called irrigation, so managing water. Something called specialization. We also have social hierarchy and government, which are two important things that we will talk about because they come up time and time again in ancient civilizations as general concepts for understanding how a civilization lived. But I'm going to wrap this video up. The things that you need to be aware of is what is BC or BCE. They're interchangeable. What is AD or CE? Understand kind of those two things and make sure you look at those key terms. And prehistory is before written records. And with that, until later.